Hi, welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Razib Khan. He is a scientist, a writer, the co-founder of the biotech company GenRAIT, and the author of the Substack Unsupervised Learning with Razib Khan, where he writes about population genetics. We spoke today about various political issues relating to genetics, assortative mating, polygenic screening and when it's going to become widely commercially available, cognitive stratification, things that people don't want to talk about in relation to things like intelligence and race, but which are all being brought out by advances in genetic science. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about 23andMe and the social and political consequences of people having in-depth knowledge of their ancestry. That extended version of the episode can be found at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the MMM chat community, the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, and also the bonus episodes that I do fortnightly with my husband. So that's at louiseperry.substack.com. Enjoy. Razib, let's start by talking about biotech and your own experiences of using reprotech. So am I right? You didn't do polygenic screening, but you did do something similar
Yeah.
for at least one of your children.
Yeah. So when you're talking about like polygenic screening, that's basically the analysis that you do on top of the data that you get. And so what we did in 2014, and if people want to like read more about it, just Google Razib Khan son. That should pull up the articles about it. MIT Tech Review did a profile. So basically, so you need the data, so you need to sequence the data. And what we did is we got we did chorionic villi sampling, get a little bit of placental tissue, which had his DNA in utero in the first trimester. And then we did a marker screen, I think like on 200 disease conditions. This is not polygenic screening because these are, like Mendelian diseases quite often or whatnot. And then I basically convinced the laboratory to give me the raw DNA, and I sequenced it, like every single position, all 3 billion positions.
Sorry, so when you say this wasn't polygenic screening, you mean you were screening for diseases that are caused by just one gene?
Yeah, so it was Mendelian screening, but then I got the data, so I could have done polygenic screening. I could have done it. I didn't. We didn't do it because technically I did pull polygenic. This is 2014, so the educational attainment stuff I could not do yet. But there's other things that you could do on that data, and I did do that. So I guess we looked at it. There was nothing objectionable. He's around, so. But he wasn't an embryo, obviously, because he was a fetus by that point. So what happens, I think it's the same in Europe, with non-invasive prenatal testing, for, you do a blood draw from the mom, and there's some tissue in there that's broken the barrier to the fetus. And so they look for things like chromosomal abnormalities that are detectable even at really, really low concentrations. And so with that, I think the termination of the abortion will happen like in the early first trimester, early to mid first trimester, because I don't think they can get it early enough that it would be first trimester. Just, people know. So that's not like embryo screening. That's, that's the screen with the abortion, right? So that's a separate thing. That's actually pretty ubiquitous right now. People don't talk about it, but
I don't know how it is in the States, but it's offered as default on the NHS that they'll test for things like Downs.
Yeah.
You have to opt out.
Yes. For the US, last I checked, which was 5 years ago, if you're 35 and above, health insurance automatically provides it. You don't have to request it. So it's a geriatric pregnancy.
Well, okay. I suppose what you could do with polygenic screening, the way that, say, Simone and Malcolm Collins have done it, I've had Simone on the podcast talk about it, is to do it as part of IVF, that you screen the different embryos and then you choose the one with the most favorable scores. I suppose theoretically you could also screen during the first trimester
that's just not very efficient.
You didn't like the scores.
Yeah.
No, that would be one objection.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking. Let's just.
What can you screen for now? Like, what's the state of play in 2023 in terms of what things you could look for in a
Well,
polygenic
I mean, it
screening?
depends on like the robustness that you're willing to accept. But I mean, obviously, there's a whole literature in genome-wide association, and and just to be concrete, like polygenic, obviously there's no like hard cutoff of like how many genes contribute to a trait, to what magnitude to say that it's polygenic. But I think a good floor would be about 100, let's say 100 positions in the genome, and then upwards of thousands and thousands. So there's 19,000 genes, 3 billion base pairs, about like 6 million variants, to give your viewers and listeners just a sense of the order of magnitude here. And so something like educational attainment, which is basically the latent variable there, is pretty much IQ. There's some other things in there, maybe conscientiousness and time preference. That's, we're talking like marker panels of hundreds of thousands to millions to get a good signal there. Height, I think, is like about like a tenth as difficult. So that's tens of thousands, maybe thousands. And then there's some other things like, say, skin color. You need like 50 to 100 markers. So that's not really polygenic in most people's eyes. But you could like do a pretty good prediction of that sort of thing. Like say like, here's a concrete thing that, because people have asked me this. Let's say that one parent has a parent who has blue eyes and a parent who has brown eyes, and they have brown eyes because, dominant, etc. And then the other parent has blue eyes, and they're like, we just want a blue-eyed kid. That's usually what they say, Well, I mean, that would be trivial to screen. That's not even polygenic. That's like 2 or 3 positions in the genome, and you can like have a very, very, very good estimate. What I will say is basically you can be 99.9% confident for particular genetic profiles that the kid has blue eyes. And then there's also other profiles that also cause blue eyes, but obviously those are not as confident. But the point is, you could do that right now, and actually, like, I'm pretty sure people are doing it. I don't know for sure, but I've had enough people ask me this that if you're doing it for disease and other things, I'm sure people are doing it just because whatever. You have 8 embryos to select from. Why not? If you don't have any disease issues you're worried about, and this is not something like educational attainment or intelligence where you're going to get into arguments with scientists about the robustness of the prediction you're making, where it's like the science is real, but how guaranteed is the output, right? Because there's uncertainty around the estimate that you're making. And so you could say, with these estimators, there's an underlying distribution that's real, the truth. And then there's the variables you're using to estimate the underlying distribution, and there's no guarantee there. So you could select for a, quote, smart embryo, and it turns out to be one of the stupid ones. I don't know, that could happen. And so then there's liability issues. So you have to be very careful how you communicate it with these complex traits. Will they get better? Yes, but there's a limit to how accurate you can make the prediction, because these traits are not, some of these polygenic traits that we're talking about are not that, they're heritable, but like, let's say like IQ, like the highest estimate I've seen from anybody is 75% heritable, which still means 25% is non-heritable. That's like developmental noise and other things. And that's not trivial. That's a big residual. So there's still going to be a noise. They can't give you a guarantee, but they can load the die, I guess. Yeah. So I guess, that's how I would frame that.
But where we're at right now, right, that this isn't really commercially available. People who are doing this are normally doing it because they're specialists in some way, and they're like you did, they're getting the genomic data and then they're doing their own analysis or using a different company or something like that. So it's not like I can't currently go to Harley Street or whatever and say I want to do polygenic screening as part of IVF. No one's going to sort of provide that as a package.
Me, so people who do.
Right.
Like,
But if I didn't have,
no, I'm trying to say is like
it's not
it's not turnkey like that. You can't. It's not like advertised, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of money in this world. There's a lot of people doing IVF, so you can like connect the dots. Like if you want to do it, if you have the money, and like we're not talking like hundreds of thousands. We're talking 50 to 100,000, something like that. I'm overestimating probably.
On top of the cost of IVF?
Yeah. I mean, I'm overestimating because often they like bundle it with the IVF, I think. But I don't know all of the details, but there are services out there. Basically, there's concierge services, and very wealthy people are already using it. They have been using it for years. So I think you know enough people. I mean, you know me, candidly. I could put you in touch with people. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's already happening. But it's a very, very, luxury good, consumption good for, I mean, you can imagine the type of person who would do this. They're not the rich people that inherited their money and are living off their trust fund. They're the rich people that made their money, and they don't want substandard children. Is the way they would, I mean, they're very, very high achieving, and they want that in the next generation by any means necessary.
At the risk of inviting you to be too candid, I've wondered if the reason I've read that Elon Musk's children have almost all been conceived through IVF, despite the mothers being perfectly young enough to be fertile. And I've wondered if that's because he might be doing polygenic screening and just hasn't said so publicly. No comment. Okay.
I don't know.
But it's true that this is probably going on right now. You're just not yet seeing ads.
I mean, I can say that it is. I mean, I think I can say it is. I mean,
yeah.
I'll confirm it. I mean, I don't think it's illegal. Like, they're not doing anything illegal. It's just the optics of it, So, I mean, I can, like I said, I can hook you up if you, I know people. That's not a difficult thing. You know what I'm saying?
How long do you think before it's completely mainstream?
If I'm conservative, I'll say 10 years. If I'm more liberal, I'll say 5 years.
And that, I mean, I think it's completely obvious that people who are currently spending more than, even if it is 50 to 100 grand, as you say, at the sort of upper limit, people are spending way more than that in private schools. So those exact people are 100% going to spend the money on making their kids, for instance, smarter to begin with. I guess the big downside at the moment is that you do have to go through IVF, which kind of sucks.
So, I mean, the best way to do polygenic screening is through mate selection. It's just cheap. It hits all of the bases. It's tried and true technology that's been around for millions of years. So I do recommend that, because people often ask about these sorts of things, and they're like, they're single, they're looking to get married, but they're asking about polygenic screening, and I'm just like, I have a very trad solution.
Yeah.
If you want tall, smart kids, go find yourself the tallest, smartest person.
Everyone else has had the same idea, unfortunately. That's the problem. There was an essay by Scott Alexander out on, I think, when it was Slate Style Codex back in the day, which I looked for recently, actually, and it's now it's now archived on the internet. I don't quite know why, but it was about ways, the evidence for things that you can do to make your children more intelligent. And he goes through everything from lead to iodine to, quite obscure stuff, and then he gets to the end and he's just like, or you could just choose a partner who's intelligent. That's your
so I mean, the way you would do it, and just the math is relatively simple. So think about it. Let's say that you have an IQ of 130, which is 2 standard deviations above the norm, and let's say you're an upper middle class person in the West. So let's just give a high heritability of 0.75. If you marry someone who is also 130, the expected value of your children is going to be 122.5 or something like that. Okay. And around that, there's a standard deviation of about 12 points. So it could go all the way down to, 70% interval could go down to 110. And then, it could be, considerably higher. Obviously, it could be higher than you. But the kid could. But the probability then in that case that the child would have an IQ below 100, so double digit, which is below average, is 5% or something. It's low, right? So you're weighing the die like that. And obviously, just if you want to do 140, the expected value would be kind of in the middle. You regress back to the mean. Anyway, the point is the math isn't that difficult. You can do it at a party, or you can do it off the top of your head. and so,
Do it at a party.
well, that's the kind of thing I do.
Maybe you do it
I
at
do
parties,
that. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah.
But because sometimes people like, why is I'll give you a concrete example. When I was in high school, I knew someone who was kind of stupid, and but they were like, their dad was a dentist, very prominent dentist, very well off, and I was like a little confused by this because like I was in a class with him and I'm like, wow, I'm gonna change his name, but it's a similar name, Dusty. He had actually a good name for a stupid person, but anyway, he was like not very smart. And I'm like, well, like average, but like he's pretty well off. And then like I met his parents, I was like, oh, okay, I see what because the dad was kind of a dork, and he had I think one criteria for his once he got super successful, and it wasn't intelligence. And so, that sort of stuff happens and people shouldn't be shocked. You get out what you put in, Oh, there's some noise, but,
Are you trying to say that the mum was much less intelligent than the dad?
Yes, and much better looking. I mean,
yeah, that's beset the British aristocracy for many centuries, right?
Well,
this is why they're often very like beautiful, but not necessarily that bright.
I mean, because he grew up in the town. He came back to town after dental school, and whatever. I was a teenager. I didn't care too much, but I was like, Dusty's dad was a dork, right? Like, I asked somebody who was like, friend's dad. It was like, yeah, he was a total dork. Like, I think he wanted to like prove, and he was he was like an endodontist, I think. So he's making a lot of money, doing really well, and he wanted to show everybody. And this is one of the ways he showed everyone, aside from the big house and everything like that. But anyway, I think Dusty works at like he sells trailers. Yeah. Anyway,
most people aren't doing that though, right? Like the assortative mating effects, particularly second half of the 20th century onwards, is super pronounced and not spoken about very often. I mean, one of the things that some listeners and viewers are going to be thinking right now is, hang on, I've read Taleb, I've read Stephen Jay Gould, whatever, IQ isn't real.
Well, I think Nassim.
What's Razib
saying?
I think
Nassim Taleb would say it's only real at the bottom end. I think that's what his argument is. Like the whole argument is kind of. I mean, he's gonna call me a fucking retard and all this stuff because he's really against like IQ. But I mean, basically, it's obviously it's obviously important at the bottom end. Nobody denies that. His argument is at the top end, it's noisy and other things matter a lot, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can just check out the literature. That's actually highly disputed. There might be like returns to very, very high. Like the stylized fact is IQ stops being important after your own IQ. Like above that, like that's what people do. Like they figure out what their IQ is. They're like, you kind of need to be this smart. And then after that, it doesn't really matter. I've noticed people do that. But the literature on that is actually like pretty disputable. And it could be that there is literature that people who are like, 160, whatever, like 4 standard deviations, 5 standard deviations, might actually be, that much smarter. The issue is the tests are really geared towards plus or minus 2, which is like 98, whatever, 96.5% of people are within those intervals, and it wants to detect people within those intervals because that's most of the work. So they're not like tuned to the really high end, and then obviously the low end is like really obvious. It's below the threshold. But anyway, you were talking about like assortative mating. And I mean, the way we do it is in the U.S. I mean, I think it's similar in England, is university, et cetera. There's these signalers, and there is, I think the stylized fact is you don't want to be with someone whose IQ is like more than a standard deviation below or above you, which makes it difficult if you're not average. More difficult. I think this is it's a weird thing, but I've talked to multiple people where it's like, like, you have to go to like a graduate school or live in a particular city or something, if you want a non-trivial pool, So let's say that your IQ is 130, you're like in the top 2%. Well, I mean, by definition, you're constraining that pool of people that are going to be like you, and so maybe you want to move to San Francisco, you want to move to New York. So you see these patterns, and actually, there's patterns in England and Estonia now where the literature is pretty clear. You look at the genes for IQ, because like we can talk about the tests, but you can also look at the genes. The genes for IQ do look like they're more concentrated in urban areas now. So smart people are moving to where other smart people are for professional reasons, but also for personal reasons, you know? And I think everyone, you know, a lot of people listening out there have probably, you know, heard people complain like they had to leave their rural area because they were such, you know, backward, blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm saying? The usual thing. So yeah, assortative mating is happening. And that's producing, you know, these stratifications. And a lot of the discussion is people at the high end, you know, at the right end of the curve, talking about the general population when the general population encounters like a totally different set of issues, you know? So before I got on this morning, I just like tweeted something out really quickly. In the United States, they're basically getting rid of stringent filters on high school graduation. So they're increasing the graduation rate. So this is good for the educationists because it looks bad that lower socioeconomic status and certain minority groups don't graduate as much because they like equity. So they're like, have everyone graduate. For people like me, this doesn't affect me at all because like my kids are not going to be just high school graduate. I mean, it's not, you know what I'm saying? It's just not relevant. Like that's just a nominal hoop. But if I was like a working class person, that diploma is actually giving a real signal. And so what's going to happen is the diploma is going to be worthless. And so people are not going to be able to distinguish the conscientious working class graduates from the non-conscientious ones. And that's going to cause problems from them. So this is the same thing that happened when in Florida, they banned asking questions about have you committed a felony? And this seems like a positive thing from a social justice perspective, but it turned out businesses just stopped hiring black people because they couldn't distinguish, you know? So, I mean, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that's irrelevant. My point is, once you get rid of any filtering mechanism, people are going to start stereotyping, you know? And if you just have only a high school diploma, well, everyone has a high school diploma. That's no signal. Like when everyone has a credential is worthless, right? So anyway, but this discussion and this like policy is happening because people who have college degrees or graduate degrees are trying to do right, and they're not thinking about it from the perspective of the person who can only graduate from high school. Like they're not college material.
Which is partly a consequence of cognitive stratification, right? Because when you're only hanging out with people who are similarly intelligent to you, you don't really know what it's like to have 90 IQ because you just wouldn't really ever have a like meaningful conversation with someone who did, to be honest.
I think the key thing for me is, you know, if you have a plumber or something, although plumbers are not, some of these like skilled trades, a lot of these people are really bright, especially with visual spatial. But, you know, how much do you talk to people? I mean, this sounds really classist, but I don't care. In like low paid service professions, you know, is it just input output and, you know, or do you like, you know,
the stereotype of British journalists is having conversations with their taxi drivers because it's basically the only time that you'll ever have a conversation. I actually saw a viral tweet this morning from someone who'd had a conversation with his Uber driver about Israel. It was Matt Chorley, who writes for the Times, had a conversation with his Uber driver and came away being like, wow, this guy's really anti-Semitic. And it's like a long history of British journalists producing columns out of like the only time they ever speak to a working class person, which is when they're sitting in their taxi.
Yeah, I mean, I have, you know, the people that do the art, whatever. There's other people. I mean, again, I don't care. Whatever. You can cancel me for being classist. I'm not really classist. I just don't hang out with poor people. So, you know.
Well, this is the point though. There's like people increasingly don't, right? So before there was a lot more internal, both internal and external migration. Like you were born in your whatever small town, and you had the normal distribution of intelligence and all other traits within the town. And if you're a 130 IQ person, you might be the smartest person in your town, and you don't have that much choice about who you speak to and who you marry because your pool is quite small. Whereas now we have people, we have the cognitive stratification problem, which probably does like massively increase productivity potentially in industries which are able to get that, get that kind of concentration. Although, have you read that now there's massive increase in autism in the Bay Area? It's probably true in other tech areas as well.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that are going on here. I do think assortative mating is part of the issue. So that just basically means, okay, two people with genes and disposition for autism, or they have Asperger's. So obviously, if you pair two people like that, the distribution of outcomes more autistic, right? The other issue is there are considerations of in terms of increased diagnosis. Okay, just like the spread of psychiatric diagnosis and stuff like that. So that actually is probably the major reason for the rise of autism, but I think a secondary reason is assortative mating because, I'm in tech. I've met engineers who have married other engineers, and it's like totally unshocking that their children have social issues because they themselves do.
And two mildly autistic people who are socially functioning might end up having a more severely autistic child.
Exactly, because it's a distribution. Like they could have a less autistic child or a more autistic child, or the highest probability is similar to them, right? But that's a probability, and so you're gonna, as you structure the population and you sort by characteristics, you're gonna get more variation in the population and these pools and concentrations of more extreme characteristics that you otherwise wouldn't get in a big random mating population.
One of the consequences of the fact that we don't really talk about this stuff publicly, like I'm going to talk about it in a podcast, and I read all of this intelligence data. You will get flayed if you write about this in a sort of mainstream publication. People don't want to talk about it, right? One quote that I read years ago from an intelligence researcher was about this phenomenon of people not wanting to talk about it is intelligent people saying that intelligence doesn't matter is like rich people saying that money doesn't matter. Like it's this incredibly powerful thing, but you're kind of not supposed to talk about it. And one of the weird effects of not talking about it is, for instance, if you look at social mobility and meritocracy, I'm thinking of the UK, but this will apply elsewhere as well. One way of reading the fact that social mobility has slowed a lot in the UK compared with, say, the 1960s, many on the left would say, well, that's because we don't really live in a meritocracy, or we had like a brief period of meritocracy, which is now gone, and that's why you're not seeing working class people upwardly mobile in the same way. Another way of reading it is that actually meritocracy has done its work, which is that it elevated very able people who have now started marrying each other and all living in London or whatever. And actually, you've just ended up genuinely with more of a caste system as a consequence of successful meritocracy. And no one wants to talk about that, right? But that's an equally, if not much more plausible way of reading the data on social mobility.
Yeah, I think that was presented at the bell curve as a possibility. More recent, or even after the bell curve, Ariana Huffington here in the United States, back when she was a conservative, she would write about it in Slate, because, and this is like the whole root of like the problem with the meritocracy in terms of the lack of self-reflection, because they think, ooh, it's like hard work or luck, and might be just your, innate tendencies to some extent. And then it's also confused a bit by the fact that it isn't deterministic. There are people who will fall from the tree, so to speak, apples who will fall further. So you're always going to know other people that like go down and people that go up. So it's hard for people. It's hard for people to think in statistical or probabilistic terms as opposed to just categories. So people will usually say, well, I know somebody who grew up really poor and now they're an exited founder. Okay, there are people like that. Yes, of course. There's many of them actually, which is good. But they're not the preponderance. And so in the United States, you see like, a huge number of professors' parents were professors. Now, some of this is like talent, but a lot of it is also just like tacit cultural understanding. I've talked to people who went into academia whose parents were lawyers, and they didn't understand a lot of the things you had to do that are unwritten. They had to learn it. And these are people whose parents were lawyers or doctors or whatever. And so the heritability is partly culturally mediated. There's a lot of tacit information. One thing, one norm is like you don't talk about IQ. You don't talk about innate, abilities if you are of the class that benefited from having those innate abilities. If you're a more regular person, actually, regular people talk about it because they see it, and they know. I will tell you guys, I think I've said this before, but when I was a kid, my parents told me, everyone's really smart and you got to work really hard. So I did work. Well, I stopped working hard when I realized it was easy. But anyway, setting that aside, I had a really bad attitude until I was in grade 7 or 7th grade, and because I just thought everyone was super lazy because they weren't doing very well. And my teacher pulled me aside and was like, you're a nice kid, but like, what's your attitude with like, especially the bottom half of the class? Whenever I had to do group projects, like I'd be like really impatient. And I was like, well, because I don't like lazy people. And like the teacher was just like, look, they're not lazy. I mean, they're just not as smart as you. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not that smart. I just like work hard. And she's like, no, I've seen how you work. You don't work that hard. And I was like, okay. And then she was like, so what do your parents do? And I'm like, well, my dad's a college professor. And I was like, okay, well, she's like, what did your grandparents do? Well, my grandfather was a doctor, whatever. And she was like, do you think like maybe it could be genes? And I was like, what? And so that was kind of my road. My 7th grade math teacher kind of like implanted that. It took me a couple of years to like look up the literature and think about it, but it did change my attitude. By high school, I wasn't as much of a dick. I mean, it definitely changed my attitude because then I started like, you start to notice things, okay? Like once this like framework is given to you, all of a sudden you start to notice that, you have friends who are working extremely hard and their output is not as high as yours, or, and also another issue is, this is kind of like a little off topic, but when you're like smart and the teachers know you're smart, they also grade you a little differently. They have different expectations. And that is like that was not clear to me when I just thought I worked really hard. I don't know why, but it's like teachers, they have a sense of like what a student is capable of, and they kind of like modify their teaching based on that. And I didn't realize that before I realized that there was like differences, which is like, in athletics and sports, that was also an issue because I'm not like the most athletic kid. Like I'm smaller than average. I had a friend who, when he hit puberty, he just got jacked and tall, and it was really easy for him. And I just remember being like, I don't think he works that hard. He was a close friend of mine. I was like, I just think he's like naturally like that. His dad was a logger. And so like I started realizing, oh, like you see this in sports all the time, but it's the same in a lot of areas of life.
Yeah, sports is quite a good analogy for people who aren't familiar with the IQ research, because you probably could come up with something like a PQ, right, physical quotient, where like for instance, Mike Tyson is apparently really good at darts, because actually you need very fine-tuned motor skills to be good at boxing, as well as having good cardio, whatever. Like, and obviously, yes, you will sometimes have people who are great at cardio and bad at strength or whatever it is, but you're going to expect there to be a correlation between all those different kind of physical abilities, which could give you something like a PQ, which is kind of analogous to cognitive ability. The thing that's kind of darkly funny about the polygenic screening about to like come onto the market in a big way is that the exact class, like professional classes who have been insisting, at least publicly, that IQ doesn't measure anything meaningful, they are absolutely not going to be able to resist using this technology. So it's going to be, I mean, probably people will just function with a degree of cognitive dissonance for a while, but I think the revealed preference will be that people do actually believe in intelligence.
Let me say something, because I've said this before. Academics in the United States are very woke and progressive, and so they hate eugenics. They talk about it all the time, and it's racist and all this stuff. I do point out who exactly is using non-invasive prenatal testing to do the screening. It's exactly these people, and there's silence. So once they start doing it, they will not talk about it anymore. It's only when it's not a common practice that people feel like they should criticize it. For example, like in vitro fertilization, there are people who are Christians who, thank God that their prayers were answered, that the cycle worked now. If you read stuff about in vitro fertilization in the 80s, this is like, oh my God, this is like the devil's work and all this stuff. Like in the New York Times, you can like go back to the archives and read it. So once something becomes common, it becomes banal. You don't talk about it. If you try to point out the contradiction, people will ignore you. Because I've tried multiple times. Because I'm okay with non-invasive prenatal testing, obviously. But when people are talking about eugenics and stuff, I'm like, wait, what are you doing? I mean, who are the people that are doing this? Like, I know when academics have their children. Like, no one like raises their hand and says, oh yeah, I terminated a Down syndrome baby, But we know who must be doing this. And actually, there is evidence that higher SES people in particular, I mean, controlling for the age, controlling for the odds, there is evidence that higher SES people, socioeconomic status people, tend to terminate more on the true positive, because whatever, I mean, I know a friend of mine was in France, and this is like 10 years ago, but he said like the evidence was really clear that higher social status people were much more, particular Like they're much more like, I would say, eugenical. Like, let me just say it that way, okay? Using these technologies, and then when they got a positive test, they'd be like, yeah, we have to terminate, Whereas like lower socioeconomic status people, sometimes they're like, oh, whatever, it's what God said or whatever, it's just not as big of a deal, and so they wouldn't terminate. And so that's just interesting to me that the people that like talk hyperventilating way about these sorts of things are always, frankly, the ones that end up using it, and then they stop talking about that particular thing and they move on to the next one. It's a little frustrating, but whatever, it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that frustrates me about people not wanting to talk honestly about intelligence is that there are, I think, loads of ways in which cognitive stratification and it's kind of unthinking effects. The fact that basically you have people any even more so than historically, anyone in a position at the top of any kind of professional hierarchy is going to be unusually intelligent, and they are the people who are making decisions which affect lots of people's lives. And because we don't talk about intelligence, we don't talk about the fact that we do make like less intelligent people's lives harder in loads of unnecessary ways. I mean, just like the basic stuff of, I don't know, banking or tax, all these things, which are actually very complex because they've been designed by intelligent people who don't realize how complex they are for everyone else. I had a really transformative moment for me because I kind of, I think, I grew up sort of progressive, and I imbibed the usual stuff about intelligence not being meaningful. And then I worked at one point with an intellectually disabled girl, and so had like extended conversations with her. And I knew her IQ because it was part of her sort of report from social services. And I was like, wow, your life is so different from my life. Just the things that she struggled to do, which seemed to me to be incredibly obvious, just things like getting the right bus at the right time, was sort of beyond her. And it made me, and ever since I have thought about the ways in which complex systems designed by intelligent people absolutely do not meet the needs of less intelligent people, and we can't even talk about it, let alone resolve it.
Well, I think the one way that it can be explained to a lot of people who are more, quote unquote, more intelligent, though, is math, because mathematics, like formal mathematics, is one area where a lot of bright people they run against their limit, and so they see, oh, it doesn't matter how hard I try, I'm not going to, for example, like I haven't taken math beyond linear algebra or multivariable calculus. Like that was obviously kind of like the limit of like me doing well. I have a friend who got a degree in math along with a degree in physics, and they realized they couldn't do math graduate student because they couldn't do algebraic geometry. This is on the high end, but I'm saying like no matter how smart you are in math, most people that are really mathematically talented in particular, they will push themselves, and then they hit the end and they're like, what's going on here? And then they realize, oh, okay, this is what it felt like for like most people with calculus, Whereas for them, it was pretty easy to do those proofs. And so I think that's one way that you can explain it, aside from the sports, in terms of like mathematical abilities. It's a little hard sometimes, I think, with the verbal stuff because people think writing is so simple. And yes, it is, but obviously the fluency in writing varies a lot based on your just ability. And so that's harder, I think, to use as an illustration, because I don't know. I think people just think, oh, they must just like spend a lot of time at it, But there are people, I mean, I probably like Christopher Hitchens would probably like, it seems like, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, he had to learn. It was a craft, but okay, the guy, obviously, the way he talked, you could tell. This guy has like a talent for prose, not just necessarily even the analysis, but the prose, right? But that's harder to explain. With math, though, I think it's really straightforward. Like people just, you hit the wall and you're just all of a sudden, you're dragging,
Yeah,
And for
yeah,
normal
yeah.
people, it's way lower, quote unquote, normal people. It's way lower. Like, like I have I mean, yeah. I mean, I know people who can barely graduate college. You know what I'm saying? Which for a lot of people out there is like, how's that happen? But there are a lot of people like that. Like they're marginal. They end up like majoring in something that allows them to graduate. But it's very difficult for them.
And our economy and culture, to some extent, probably privilege intelligence more than maybe any other that's existed before. I mean, the extent to which, if you come from a modest background and you're very intelligent, you can make so much more money, I think, than in any other culture maybe that has ever existed. So like these are very
Yeah,
valuable
like if you're an
traits.
intelligent person, if you're very intelligent, I mean, look, I know a lot of people who don't make as much money as they could, but it's because they're lazy. But they're also very smart.
Yeah. I mean, conscientiousness is the other big factor.
So I know people who are like very intelligent, who are low conscientiousness, and they can kind of make it in the middle class because they're just so fast, you know? But if they were not that smart, they would not be able to get a job. But they can always catch themselves at the end and, you know, do things at the last second, and that's just like their raw speed, you know? I do tell these people, I'm like, look, if you just like started doing it when you're supposed to start doing it, but whatever, you know, that's not my, like, I'm in the middle on conscientiousness, you know, that's why I'm not a doctor, I'm in the middle. So a lot of scientists, by the way, are in the middle. Because like that's why they didn't become a lawyer, because like the really high conscientious people tend to follow the rules and go like in that linear sequence. And in certain types of entrepreneurship and academia, that's actually not optimal because you might pick the wrong thing, you know?
I'm super, super conscientious. I'm like 99th centile conscientious or something like that. But I've read that proper geniuses, like the Isaac Newton types who are unusual, they tend to have quite unique personality profiles. They are obviously very intelligent, but they're often very disagreeable, for instance, because you kind of have to be disagreeable in order to say outrageous things in your field.
A stylized fact is like in the United States, at least doctors are high IQ people who are pretty conscientious and also pretty agreeable.
Yeah, that's me. I mean, I went to medical school. I'm a medical school dropout, so there but for the grace of God.
I mean, if you have to work with patients, I mean, surgeons might be the exception here, but if you have to work with patients and stuff like that, you can't be, you know. So I'm like, I'm actually posting a podcast this week. I did with a personality psychologist. So it's like really interesting, all the different things. But so I'm very disagreeable, very high openness, and then very extroverted, not neurotic at all, and moderate conscientiousness. So that's, you know, I mean, I think most people could guess most of that.
I'm really high in everything. That's my unusual personality profile.
Well, there's sex differences. This is like spoken of when I talk to psychologists. There's sex differences, like say neuroticism. Like women are much more neurotic and much more agreeable.
Post-puberty, that's what's really interesting, and that's what suggests that it is like an innate difference. Well, I suppose you could look at it both ways, but when you test, say, 10-year-old kids who've had plenty of socialization already, you don't see these differences, and then once they go through puberty, you see them.
If you have like an all-male group, privately, aside from talking about sports and sex, another thing is like the ability to tolerate a range of opinion, in my experience, is much greater when there are women in the room. Usually with women in the room, I have to like talk over them and just tell them to shut up, which most men will not do, candidly. Because women are like...
It's because of your disagreeableness, Razib.
Don't be rude. Don't be rude. That's problematic. I'm like, I don't give a shit what you say, you know? And like the other guys are like, whoa. But like when it's just guys, candidly, that does not usually happen. Because like you're not performing in front of a woman, and like we don't like care, you know? Like who cares, you know? But so you can be in a room and like some guys like far right and some guys like a communist, and like you just like argue it out and like whatever, you know? And then you like have a beer. And it's like a totally different dynamic, and something I like kind of figured out only as an adult, because you know I grew up in the normal world where it's like everything is mixed gender, you know? But then like there are certain circumstances where it's just only guys, and you just start to see, oh, this is actually quite different. And I'm sure with women, there's other things going on there. I don't know, because I'm not, you know, I don't identify as a woman, you know. I just think that's something that's not talked enough about. People don't talk enough about it. I mean, I know you talk about it, and like Mary Harrington talks about it, just in terms of how the influx of women into professions, for example, has changed things a lot. And a lot of it just comes down to personality and how women operate in groups versus how men operate in groups. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. So like, you know, concretely, like in academia, there were these like really, really harsh, like unpleasant individuals that were just tolerated and accepted because that's how they are. And now these people are not tolerated. They either have to just like not talk at all, or they're not promoted, or they're not hired, whatever. And that's because a lot of women, especially younger women, will not tolerate that. And that's kind of good. The bad part of it is, though, are we going to get I mean, because Isaac Newton was probably one of those people from what I've like read about his personality. These are like geniuses that will just not tolerate. They don't, you know, operate with normal niceties. They have no patience for you if you're not at their level. And I've interacted with these people because I was in academia like 10 years ago. And I mean, if these guys, because they're almost all guys, not always, but almost all these guys, they're mostly guys. There's some women like this too. But if they respect you, they will give you a time of day, and they're actually like very, I mean, it's enriching to interact with them. But if they don't respect you, they don't know who you are. It's really, really unpleasant. And I get that, but we have trade-offs in our society,
I might yet write a book on this, like the feminization of public life hypothesis. So my suspicion is that a lot of social changes and political changes that we've seen over the last, say, 70 years are to do with the mass influx of middle-class women into the professions that originally were dominated by men. And you would expect there to be, like, obvious, we all know this, going back to what you said earlier, a lot of people, including smart people, are not good at realizing that average differences between groups does not determine individual profiles, right? I mean, the thing is, they often can. If you say, like, look, most tall parents are going to have taller kids. Occasionally, they have a shorter kid. They can kind of wrap their heads around it, but it's more difficult when it comes to personality and intelligence and stuff. But anyway, we know that there are significant differences between men and women in terms of personality. You would expect that to play out in institutions that go from being entirely male to being largely female, and that probably does explain a lot of what we've seen culturally, like, and yeah, for good and ill. I think that there are good and bad effects. One effect, for instance, like in policing, for instance, is policing has actually become a lot less violent. You wouldn't know this from listening to BLM or whatever, but the kind of routine violence that used to be dealt out by police officers really has gone. And in things like the Met Police in London is like a third women now. It's a lot, like completely historically unprecedented numbers of women in policing. And probably my guess is that the drop in violence is because women are much less likely to be violent in that kind of context.
Which it changed the whole culture of expectations too. I mean, that's the key that I think one thing the one thing I would say is like that I understand now is, with the initial influx of women into the professions where they're allowed in, even encouraged to some extent, these are still like male normative institutions and cultures. And so when they're like 10 to 20 to 25%, these are basically, they are women, they're biological females, but they accept and accede to the cultural standards and norms that were already pre-existent.
And they're probably quite masculine themselves as well.
Yeah, there might be self-selection. What happens, though, is as the fraction increases, all of a sudden, they can change the culture. And that's what happens, and that's what I've seen happen. In academia, you can see it in a very, very, it's almost like in a controlled experiment way, because different disciplines have different proportions of women at different times. So, for example, there are still fields of engineering. Those departments are still actually quite masculine in a lot of ways. And, that's just how it is. But then, like, there's other fields like economics and philosophy, I think, where there's now enough women where it's starting to change. So economists are harsh. We're harsh. People like Larry Summers, that was typical. That's changing. And a lot of it, I mean, people have talked about it explicitly. A lot of it is like the influx of women and the change of how women feel, how acceptable it is to, get up as a senior academic and basically humiliate a graduate student, at a conference, and it's like, okay, like, and I didn't even say this. It's just like most guys are not going to cry. Okay. But like, that's happened. And people don't want that to happen, so you got to change the norms. Like, there are women who will just, I don't know. It's weird. I'm just like, why are you crying? You know what I'm saying? Like, when that happens, it's just like, whoa. It's like everyone kind of freaks out because guys don't do that. So we don't have like any, like, our reflex is like, whoa, what happened? And, anyway. But like, so economics and also like law schools in the U.S., again, like, it's not explicitly said, but the intense like verbal jousting that used to happen is way, way discouraged now, only within the last 5 years. And I think it's because women finally put their foot down and we're just like, look, why do you have to be such a dick? But I mean, I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just how it is.
I think it's probably good and bad, just like depending on the context. I want to ask about another area where people are really hypocritical, right? So we've talked about intelligence. Can we talk also about genetic sequencing and race? Because again, the fashionable view, particularly in academia and kind of progressive circles, is that race isn't real. It's all incredibly superficial and sketchy and yada, yada, yada. Oh, and also here's my 23andMe, which tells me exactly where I'm from. And again, people seem to just kind of live with that. They don't. The cognitive dissonance kind of goes unsaid, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, this is complicated. I mean, this is like the kind of thing like, some like communist scientists will clip and white supremacists, But
We can put it behind. We can put it behind the paywall, Razib. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.